Spring 1945. The Reich is collapsing, and convoys of prisoners are pouring across Europe's roads. Among them, German women auxiliaries, nurses, and clerks pulled from the ruins of hospitals and command posts. Dust swirled as American trucks replaced cattle cars, their engines rattling under the weight of uniforms and exhausted bodies. For many of these women, this was the first time they were carried not by the Wehrmacht, but by the enemy. They sat rigid, expecting cruelty with every turn of the wheels. As the convoy moved west, the memories of propaganda films replayed in their heads. They had been told that capture meant degradation, starvation, or worse. Some clutched small handbags, the last remnants of civilian life, while others still wore field-gray jackets hanging loose over thin shoulders. The trucks rumbled through towns now flying white sheets from windows. Every passing mile deepened the fear of the unknown. NNTHE numbers told a harsher truth. By May 1945, U.S. forces held an estimated 370,000 German POWs, many of them women. Prisoners were processed in bulk, paperwork stamped in hurried offices, and then scattered across a vast network of transit depots. Some of the women whispered prayers, others cursed under their breath. All carried the same question: how long before the hunger returned? Inside the trucks, the air was thick with silence. The smell of sweat and dust clung to them. A few dared to look at the young American soldiers seated at the edges, rifles across their knees. The GIs avoided eye contact, focusing on the road, as though distance could erase the tension between captor and captive. One woman later recalled in her diary, "We thought they would starve us." That expectation pressed down heavier than the steel frames of the vehicles. And as the convoy finally slowed, the outline of fences rose ahead. Barbed wire stretched taut, towers jutting upward. At first glance, it seemed to confirm every fear planted by years of propaganda. Yet beyond the gates, a different sight emerged. The camp was not a mud pit, not a dungeon. Instead, neat rows of wooden barracks stood in order, their roofs patched, their windows intact. The shock of order cut sharply against the chaos the women had just left behind in Germany. This first glimpse was only the beginning. What lay beyond the barbed wire would turn their fears upside down. The trucks halted, dust settled, boots hit gravel, and orders echoed in English. The German women climbed down, stiff from hours of travel. Ahead, barbed wire framed a compound that should have confirmed their worst fears. Yet, what caught their eyes was not decay, but order. Straight lines of barracks, roofs intact, wooden steps freshly hammered. Even the gravel paths seemed raked, as if someone had prepared for guests, not captives. They shuffled past a watchtower, guarded by a single GI with his rifle slung low. There were no snarling dogs, no shouted insults. Instead, a clerk, seated at a folding desk, checked their names against typed lists. The precision felt alien. The Reich they had left was burning. Here, in enemy hands, there was calm routine. Some women exchanged glances, struggling to reconcile the sight with the nightmares they had imagined. Across the United States, more than 500 POW camps stood by 1945, stretching from New England to the Deep South. Oklahoma alone held several thousand captives in sprawling compounds surrounded by farmland. This particular camp looked almost pastoral, its barracks laid out like a small town. Some reports note flower beds planted by earlier prisoners, faint patches of color breaking the monotony of wooden walls. To the women, these details hit harder than any guard's command. One auxiliary whispered, "It looks cleaner than our homes." The line carried bitter truth. After years of bombing and shortages, many German towns had become rubble heaps. Here, in captivity, the air smelled not of smoke and ash, but of pine planks and fresh soil. It was a disorienting comfort, one that unsettled as much as it soothed, NNTHE Americans ushered them into an open yard for roll call. A whistle blew, numbers were counted, and silence stretched. Beyond the wire, fields rolled out green and endless, a sight untouched by war. Some women stared through the fences, wondering if freedom lay only a few yards away. Yet the structure of camp life was already tightening around them. This was just the threshold. Soon they would be led into barracks, assigned bunks, and introduced to routines that would challenge everything they thought they knew about captivity. The next shock would arrive not with orders or guards, but with steam and running water. The barracks doors creaked open, and instead of dark, damp interiors, the women were guided toward a low building where steam hissed against tin roofs. The guards pointed, their English clipped and firm. Inside, a row of shower stalls waited. For a moment, the women froze. Memories of rumors and threats surged back. In Nazi camps, showers had carried unspeakable associations. Here, the water ran clear, hot, and real. One by one, they stepped under it, shivering not from cold, but disbelief. In buckets of soap were passed along, thick bars with American stamps pressed into them. Some women clutched the soap like treasure, inhaling the sharp scent of lye and lavender, smells long absent from the wreckage of Germany. The guards looked away, respecting privacy as best they could, leaving the prisoners to scrub years of grime and fear from their skin. The water cascaded, washing not only dirt but fragments of identity back onto weary bodies. Reports from the International Red Cross noted that prisoners in U.S. camps were given 2 to 3 showers per week, a luxury unheard of in the collapsing Reich. Lice were combed out, hair was deloused, and new linens waited on bunks. For women who had gone months without proper bathing, the sting of soap in the eyes felt like both pain and salvation. The silence in the shower room was broken only by dripping water and the faint sound of muffled sobs. One auxiliary whispered afterward, "Our own officers never gave us this." It was a confession, laced with shame and shock. In the Wehrmacht, women had often been treated as expendable, pushed into collapsing hospitals and field offices without regard for their health. Yet here, in enemy hands, hygiene was enforced not as punishment, but as policy. The contradiction gnawed at them. When the showers ended, their old uniforms were bundled up for laundering. Towels, thick, clean, American issue, were handed out. The women wrapped themselves in fabric that felt impossibly soft compared to the rough wool they had worn for years. Some lingered, reluctant to let go of the warmth. Others pulled the towels tight, as though afraid this brief humanity might be stripped away again. NNBUT, the Americans were already preparing the next step. Outside, quartermasters had piled bundles of clothing, jackets, and boots. The shock of hygiene was only the prelude. Soon, the women would discover that even the clothes they wore would be reshaped by captivity. When the women stepped back into the yard, hair damp and skin scrubbed raw, they found piles of clothing stacked on wooden crates. American quartermasters barked orders, pointing toward bundles of uniforms stitched from U.S. Army stock. The garments smelled of starch and storage, a sharp contrast to the sweat-soaked German field gray they had worn for years. Each woman received a jacket, trousers, shirt, and boots, standard issue, designed for men, and miles away from anything feminine. NNTHE moment, they slipped into the oversized jackets. The transformation felt uncanny. Sleeves dangled past wrists, belts cinched around thin waists, and boots clomped noisily against gravel. The effect was almost comic, yet the atmosphere was heavy. They had been stripped of their old insignia, their uniforms symbols of authority and service. Now, clothed in enemy fabric, they looked like shadows of soldiers belonging to neither side. The weight of this identity shift pressed silently into their posture. Numbers told the scale. The U.S. Army Quartermaster Corps distributed thousands of sets of surplus uniforms to incoming POWs across hundreds of camps. This efficiency reflected industrial might, warehouses bursting with fabrics, leather, and boots. For the German women, who had seen their homeland ration soap and shred curtains into makeshift dresses, the abundance was staggering. Some muttered under their breath, unable to reconcile captivity with the sheer quantity of goods the Americans treated as expendable. One nurse murmured, "We looked like soldiers again, but not ours." Her words echoed a larger truth. The uniforms both stripped and reshaped identity. For the first time, they were equal not as Germans but as captives, dressed in the same anonymous olive drab. The irony bit hard. They had served a Reich that exalted hierarchy and symbols, yet now stood reduced to blankness in foreign cloth. Amazed, they adjusted belts and rolled up sleeves. A new sensation began creeping in, unease mixed with reluctant comfort. The fabric was warm, the boots sturdy, the pockets deep. Some women dared to admit, if only in their thoughts, that these clothes were better made than what they had been issued back home. The contradiction gnawed at them, raising unspoken comparisons between the crumbling Reich and the logistical machine that had defeated it. NNBUT, the greatest surprise was still to come. Quartermasters waved them toward another line, where crates stamped with red crosses waited. Inside lay parcels that would shock them more deeply than uniforms ever could. The line shifted toward a series of crates stacked waist-high, each marked with a red cross and stenciled lettering. Guards slit them open with bayonets, revealing neatly packed parcels. The women watched, uncertain. Supply boxes had meant rations in Germany, but always scarcity, always less than promised. Here, though, the parcels seemed endless. Each was the size of a small suitcase, heavy with unknown contents. One by one, the women were handed their own, the weight surprising in their arms. When they tore the seals, the shock was immediate. Inside lay treasures, tins of Spam, blocks of chocolate, powdered milk, even coffee. Cigarettes were wrapped in crisp paper, stacked like currency. To women who had watched German civilians scrape crumbs from bombed-out bakeries, this felt unreal. The smell of cocoa and tobacco filled the air, overwhelming the dusty yard. Some clasped the chocolate to their chests as though it were gold. Others simply stared, unable to believe such things existed in wartime. NNTHE numbers told the story of abundance. Records show that in a single month, 24,000 Red Cross parcels were distributed to prisoners in U.S. custody. Each weighed around 11 pounds, a compact symbol of American supply lines that stretched across oceans. Where Germany struggled to feed its civilians, the enemy could flood even its captives with goods. The disparity cut deep. One auxiliary whispered bitterly, "Even German civilians had nothing like this." It was not envy alone, it was disbelief. For years, propaganda had described Americans as greedy, wasteful, barbaric. Yet here, in the hands of prisoners, were foodstuffs that felt like peacetime luxuries. The contradiction destabilized everything they thought they knew. NNTHE guards watched the reactions with quiet curiosity. To them, this was procedure, a routine of distribution. To the women, it was an earthquake of perception. Some immediately bartered cigarettes for favors or traded coffee for extra blankets. Others hid their parcels under bunks, afraid this abundance might vanish as suddenly as it appeared. The taste of chocolate on the tongue was almost too much, a reminder of a civilian life long buried under rubble. NNBUT, amid the canned goods and tobacco, lay something stranger still. In one parcel, a slim cardboard box slid out, rattling faintly. A woman pried it open and gasped. Nestled inside was not food, not medicine, but a stick of deep red. Lipstick. The sight sparked laughter from the guards and stunned silence from the women. The small box rattled again in her palm. She tipped it, and a tube slid out. Shiny metal casing, twisting open to reveal a vivid red tip. Lipstick. For a long moment the women simply stared. This was not food, not clothing, not survival. It was something entirely different, a reminder of femininity buried under years of uniforms and hunger. A young GI chuckled, muttering, "Girls need it too," before moving on with his clipboard. The absurdity of it all broke against the silence like a wave. Hands reached hesitantly. One woman brushed the color against her wrist, a streak of red blooming across pale skin. Gasps followed. Another turned the tube in the light, the creamy surface catching sun through barbed wire. The guards seemed amused, but for the women, the impact was seismic. Lipstick had vanished from German stores years earlier. Factories that once produced cosmetics had been converted to churn out ammunition. Here, in captivity, luxury returned not through mercy, but through logistics. Numbers underscored the shock. The U.S. wartime economy poured billions into production, and cosmetics were no exception. Millions of tubes of lipstick rolled off American assembly lines, both for civilians and for morale kits issued to servicewomen. The abundance was so great that even POW parcels could absorb such items without notice. For the prisoners, raised in scarcity, the idea was almost unthinkable. One nurse whispered, "We had not seen lipstick in years." Her voice trembled between awe and sorrow. Some prisoners recoiled, thinking it frivolous amid war. Others clutched the tubes tightly, as if claiming back stolen identity. The red color contrasted brutally with their ill-fitting olive-drab uniforms, a splash of life against fabric that erased their roles as women. In those small sticks lay a dangerous, intoxicating memory of self. NNBUT lipstick also sowed divisions. Younger auxiliaries laughed nervously, eager to try it. Older women frowned, dismissing it as weakness. Guards leaned on the fence, curious to see which side would win. For the first time in captivity, arguments brewed not over food or shelter, but over something as delicate as cosmetics. Still, the lure was undeniable. That evening, one prisoner dared smear a careful line across her lips. In the reflection of a broken tin plate, a face stared back that had been lost to war. Yet this rediscovered self would not remain private for long. Soon even shards of glass would become mirrors, amplifying the shock of color in a world drained of it. Night settled over the camp, the hum of insects filling the air. Inside one of the barracks, a prisoner crouched by her bunk, holding a shard of broken glass, no larger than her palm. She lifted it toward her face, her hands trembling. In the dim light of a single bulb, she traced the lipstick across her lips, uneven but bold. The reflection staring back was strange, half soldier, half woman, caught between war and memory. For a long breath, she simply looked, rediscovering herself in silence. Others gathered, curious, whispering in disbelief. The shard passed from hand to hand, each woman testing the red smear against her mouth or cheek. Their laughter was quiet, nervous, as though the guards might punish them for vanity. But no orders came. Instead, the barracks filled with the faint scent of wax and perfume, alien in a place designed for control. It was a rebellion of identity, carried out in whispers and stolen minutes. Evidence from photographs and diaries shows that POWs often hid such items, tucking cosmetics into mattress seams or beneath floorboards. In this camp, the lipstick became a secret ritual, shared among those who dared. Reports indicate some prisoners even used beet juice or boot polish to extend the illusion, desperate to preserve this fragile return of dignity. These small acts stood in contrast to the stark statistics of captivity: one guard for every 30 to 40 prisoners, routines rigid and impersonal. German auxiliary later recalled, "It felt like dignity returning." The line captures the paradox. Captivity stripped them of freedom, yet lipstick restored a fragment of self long denied by both war and their own regime. The red lines across faces glowed faintly in the barracks light, symbols not of surrender but of survival. Yet even this fragile ritual carried risks. Rivalries brewed. Who would hold the mirror longest, who deserved the first swipe of color. Old hierarchies reasserted themselves, senior nurses pressing claims over younger auxiliaries. Tension simmered, echoing the chain of command they thought they had escaped. For a few hours, the camp transformed into a stage of petty contests, as though lipstick mattered more than bread. NNTHE guards noticed. They stood outside the barracks, leaning on rifles, watching with a mix of curiosity and amusement. To them, it was harmless. To the women, it was everything. Soon, those rivalries would break the surface, igniting arguments that even the Americans could not ignore. By the second week, the novelty of lipstick gave way to something sharper: competition. Inside the barracks, whispers rose into arguments. Senior nurses, once accustomed to rank and respect, insisted they should be the first to use the parcels. Younger auxiliaries, hardened by frontline chaos, pushed back with equal fire. The barracks crackled with tension as the tiny ritual of cosmetics became a battlefield for authority. It was no longer about survival alone. It was about who controlled fragments of dignity. One evening, the disputes erupted into shouting. A lipstick tube changed hands too many times, and a scuffle broke out on the wooden floor. Guards rushed in, rifles slung but fingers off triggers, watching the women claw at each other over a stick of red wax. The absurdity was not lost on anyone. American camp reports often noted such quarrels, chalking them up to stress and hierarchy breakdown. But to the prisoners, these moments cut deep. Echoes of the rigid structures they thought had collapsed, with the Reich NNTHE statistics, underline how fragile order could be. With one guard for every 30 to 40 captives, discipline inside the barracks often relied on self-policing. Leaders emerged naturally, sometimes echoing Nazi ranks, other times fractured by resentment. In female camps, cosmetics and clothing sharpened these divides more than food did. The items symbolized not just beauty, but power. Who could command respect, who could still feel like more than a number. One woman snapped during an interrogation, "We fought harder for lipstick than bread." The line was later quoted in camp records, shocking American officers who assumed hunger would dominate all disputes. But for the women, lipstick and dresses were more than luxuries. They were weapons against erasure, reminders they were still themselves. And those who controlled them wielded influence within the wire. NNTHE guards, mostly 19- and 20-year-olds, found themselves puzzled spectators. They had been trained to watch for escape attempts, sabotage, or political resistance, not rivalries over cosmetics. Some leaned on the fence, trading cigarettes for stories, quietly amused. Others shook their heads, baffled at how quickly status could reform in captivity. NNBUT. Soon, curiosity grew into fascination. The guards began to see these women less as nameless prisoners and more as unpredictable individuals, breaking every stereotype the war had drilled into them. That shift in perception would open doors neither side expected, starting with small exchanges across the barbed wire. The quarrels inside the barracks had not gone unnoticed. From the watchtowers and wire posts, the young American guards watched the women argue, laugh, and barter. At first, it was entertainment and an otherwise monotonous duty. But slowly, curiosity took root. These weren't faceless enemies anymore. They were women who sang in German, stitched uniforms into makeshift dresses, and fought over lipstick like sisters in a household. For guards barely out of high school, the scene felt both alien and familiar. Most of the guards were little older than the prisoners themselves. Records show the average GI overseeing POW camps in 1945 was just 19 to 21 years old, barely trained in foreign languages, carrying rifles more for formality than fear. To them, the German women were not threatening soldiers but strange guests behind barbed wire. Some guards began trading. A cigarette slipped for a song, a chocolate bar swapped for a sketch of an American Jeep. These small transactions carried no official sanction, but they became daily rituals. NNTHE women, too, sensed the shift. They had expected hostility, yet found a mix of amusement and sympathy in the eyes of their keepers. One recalled later, "They treated us more gently than our own men." The sentence landed heavy in post-war accounts, a quiet admission that shattered years of propaganda. For women used to harsh discipline from German officers, the light touch of these boyish guards seemed surreal. That night, the exchanges deepened. A guard would ask for a German lullaby, leaning against the fence while the women sang softly under the barracks lamp. Others requested handwriting samples, fascinated by the sharp angles of German script. These were not grand gestures, but tiny bridges built out of boredom and humanity. For the prisoners, every cigarette or smile blurred the line between enemy and captor. For the guards, the line blurred too, between duty and simple human curiosity. Yet these small encounters carried risks. Officers higher up warned against fraternization, and suspicion grew that guards might be manipulated. Still, the nightly hum of German voices drifted across the compound, unpunished, unnoticed by anyone who didn't want to notice. NNTHAT curiosity would soon expand beyond cigarettes and songs. As weeks passed, the camp discovered ways to occupy the women, ways that transformed idle hours into moments of creativity, sewing, and games that gave captivity a rhythm neither side had anticipated. Afternoons in the camp began to follow a rhythm. Once roll call and chores were done, guards opened the yard gates and allowed prisoners to spill into open spaces. Some gravitated toward the sports field, where a tattered ball thumped against dust. Others clustered in shaded corners, bent over needles and thread. Recreation was not just a luxury, it was policy. The Americans believed activity kept order, and so they supplied kits, sewing needles, yarn, even scraps of fabric pulled from quartermaster stores. NNTHE women seized on it. Oversized men's uniforms were hacked apart, reshaped into crude skirts or blouses. Sleeves became sashes, trouser legs became makeshift dresses. The camp soon looked less like a barracks and more like a workshop, the air filled with the rhythmic pull of thread through cloth. For some, it was a return to normalcy. For others, it was quiet rebellion. Each stitch was a reminder that identity could be remade, even in captivity. NN numbers underline the intent. U.S. records note that prisoner camps across the country distributed hundreds of sewing kits and sports items, from baseballs to chessboards. It was a strategy of control, but to the women, it became a lifeline. The thud of boots on a field and the scrape of scissors on fabric replaced silence and despair. Photographs showed German women laughing in yards, holding sewing patterns up to the sun, as if reimagining themselves piece by piece. And one POW later admitted, "We reshaped men's clothes into our own." The act carried weight far beyond fabric. In Germany, their identities had been consumed by uniforms and war work. In captivity, creativity offered a fragile reclaiming of womanhood. Even guards found themselves pausing to watch, bemused at the sight of prisoners parading patched-together skirts along the wire. NNTHE yard filled with contrasts, one group playing volleyball, another humming folk songs as they cut cloth, a third squabbling over thread colors. It was captivity, but it was also a strange echo of civilian life, stitched together from scraps of an enemy's abundance. The effect was both haunting and hopeful, a reminder that life insisted on pushing forward, even behind fences. NNBUT whispers soon spread. Rumors that real dresses, proper garments, not stitched uniforms, were on their way. Whether true or not, anticipation rippled through the camp. When the day came, the surprise proved greater than any rumor could have promised. The rumor turned into reality on a clear morning when a Red Cross truck rattled into the compound. The women gathered near the fence, expecting food parcels or medical supplies. Instead, crates were lowered and pried open with crowbars. Inside were stacks of folded cotton and floral prints, actual dresses, stitched in U.S. factories and shipped thousands of miles. The sight froze the prisoners in silence. For years they had worn only uniforms, patched rags, or men's cast-offs. Now, garments that belonged to another world were being handed across the yard, and guards called names and distributed them one by one. Fingers brushed fabrics that felt impossibly soft compared to coarse wool. Some women pressed the dresses against their faces, inhaling scents of fresh cloth and soap. Others held them up to the light, stunned by patterns, roses, checks, even pale stripes. To those who had forgotten what it meant to be seen as women, the shock bordered on painful. Reports from camp inventories confirmed that hundreds of garments were delivered to POW compounds through Red Cross aid in 1945. While numbers varied, the effect was consistent: sudden eruptions of joy, disbelief, and rivalry. For the Americans, this was routine welfare distribution. For the women, it was an earthquake of identity. One German prisoner whispered, "We looked like women again, not soldiers." The phrase captured the rupture. In the Reich, they had been auxiliaries and cogs in a crumbling machine. In U.S. captivity, dresses returned them to a role they had been denied by war. Some laughed nervously, parading awkwardly in new clothes while boots clomped beneath. Others folded theirs neatly, unwilling to wear them in front of guards. NNTHE transformation did not go unnoticed. Guards stood along the fence, nudging each other, surprised at how swiftly the atmosphere shifted. What had been a gray crowd in baggy uniforms now glimmered with patches of color. Even prisoners who refused to wear the dresses felt the tension of choice pressing on them. For a brief moment, the camp no longer looked like a military compound. It resembled a small-town Sunday gathering. NNBUT, the true shock came not in the yard, but in the quiet of evening. Dressed in cotton prints and clutching lipstick, the women began walking the fenced paths, their footsteps measured, their heads high. What began as handouts turned into ritual, the Sunday stroll, and it unsettled both captives and guards alike. Sunday afternoons changed the atmosphere inside the wire. Once chores were complete and roll call dismissed, women emerged from barracks not in shapeless uniforms but in cotton dresses. The fabrics were light, floral, sometimes striped, a jarring contrast to the drab olive and gray that had defined their lives for years. Boots clomped beneath hemmed skirts, belts cinched awkwardly. But for the first time, the campyard resembled something like a promenade. Guards leaned against fences, arms folded, watching the spectacle unfold. NNTHE ritual became predictable. Women would gather in pairs or trios, pacing the gravel paths inside the perimeter. They talked softly, sometimes laughed, occasionally sang. From the towers, the guards could hardly believe what they saw: an enemy that only months earlier had worn swastikas now walking in dresses under American watch. It looked less like captivity and more like some surreal suburban gathering transplanted into barbed wire. In sources indicate that Sunday was the designated recreation day in many U.S. camps, marked by music, games, and relaxed supervision. Here, it became a catwalk of sorts. Photographs from similar compounds show POWs holding parasols fashioned from scraps or adjusting handmade sashes. To the women, it was a fragile reclaiming of normalcy. To the guards, it was uncanny. Prisoners looking freer than civilians in war-torn Europe. In one auxiliary admitted later, "We looked freer than civilians at home." The line cut to the heart of the paradox. Behind wire they had regular meals, clean clothes, even moments of leisure. Outside in Germany, their families faced rubble, hunger, and despair. The guilt and relief of this realization lingered with every Sunday stroll. And beyond the fence, local civilians sometimes gathered, drawn by curiosity. Farmers, wives, children, and townsfolk stood at a distance, watching the strange procession of German women circling in dresses. Some stared in silence, others whispered disapproval. To the prisoners, The stairs carried weight. They were both spectacle and ghost, neither civilians nor soldiers, walking in loops that led nowhere. NNTHE strolls unsettled everyone in different ways. Guards laughed, civilians gawked, and prisoners questioned what freedom even meant. Yet this odd ritual laid the groundwork for something larger. Soon, the gaze of civilians outside the wire would shift from curiosity to contact, and with it, the camp's boundaries blurred in ways no guardrail could fully control. Word spread quickly in the nearby town. Farmers driving wagons past the camp slowed to glimpse the strange sight. German women in dresses, strolling behind barbed wire as if on holiday. On Sundays, families gathered along the perimeter roads, children perched on fence posts, wives clutching baskets. They stared at the prisoners not with fear, but with uneasy fascination. For small-town America, the war had felt distant: ration books, draft lists, letters from sons overseas. Now, its enemy was walking in plain sight, laughing in cotton prints. NNTHE first reactions were disbelief. Housewives whispered, wondering why prisoners were allowed such comfort. Some muttered that their own closets held less after years of rationing. Yet curiosity softened judgment. Town records and oral histories describe locals lingering for hours, watching the women promenade as though the camp had become a theater. The POWs, self-conscious under so many eyes, straightened their posture, turning every lap around the yard into a performance. Statistics underscore the scale of contact. Many U.S. camps housed 2,000 or more prisoners, often within a mile or two of rural communities. Barbed wire separated captives from civilians, but only just. Children pressed faces to the fence, trading names with women who replied in halting English. Farmers noted their wives asking questions. Were these truly the same Germans who had bombed London, who had marched across Europe? The contradiction gnawed at assumptions. One auxiliary recalled, "We were stared at like creatures from another world." The gaze carried weight, half curiosity, half judgment. Some prisoners felt humiliated, turned into spectacles. Others saw opportunity, softening their expressions, trying to appear less threatening, more human. The exchanges became subtle negotiations of image, played out through the simple act of walking in circles. NNNOT, all civilians disapproved. Some were drawn closer, compelled to bridge the distance. It began with small gestures: a nod, a smile, a child slipping a wildflower through the wire. Guards noticed, but often looked the other way. The camp's rigid order had cracked, and through that crack, human contact began to filter. And soon, the gifts became tangible. Apples, handkerchiefs, and scraps of food passed through the wire. What began as staring turned into sharing, shifting the boundaries of captivity once more. It began almost imperceptibly. A child pushed an apple through the wire, giggling before his mother pulled him back. A few days later, a farmer's wife slipped a folded handkerchief into a guard's hand with a whispered request to pass it along. Before long, these gestures became routine. German women emerged from barracks with cautious smiles, waiting to see what might appear between fence posts. Gifts were small: fruit, scraps of bread, sewing patterns torn from magazines, but each carried enormous weight inside the camp. NNTHE exchanges took on ritual form. Civilians lingered outside the fence on weekends, parcels tucked under shawls. Guards often pretended not to notice, their eyes fixed elsewhere as hands moved quickly. Some even facilitated the transfers, curious themselves to watch how the women reacted. A handkerchief embroidered with flowers sparked laughter in one barrack. An apple was sliced into slivers and shared among 6. Every gift carried meaning, proof that the enemy could also be neighbor. Official records logged hundreds of civilian contacts near U.S. POW camps in 1945, often described as unauthorized fraternization. Authorities worried about security breaches, yet the items that passed the wire were rarely contraband. Instead, they were tokens of normal life: recipes, scraps of fabric, even music sheets. For women stripped of civilian identity, these tokens felt like messages from another world. One auxiliary later asked bitterly, why did they share with enemies? The question carried both confusion and gratitude. German propaganda had painted Americans as brutal, vengeful, unforgiving. Yet here, small-town wives and children offered gifts more gently than their own officers ever had. The paradox forced reflection and whispered conversations long after lights out and NOT, all prisoners welcomed the exchanges. Some worried the gifts created debts, invisible strings tying them to their captors. Others felt shame, taking food while their families starved in Germany. Yet most accepted, unable to deny the relief of tasting an apple or holding cloth softer than any uniform. The fence became less a barrier and more a market of human contact, fragile and unrecorded. NNBUT with every apple and handkerchief. Another question grew louder inside the camp. If kindness existed on this side of the wire, what did that mean about everything they had been told before capture? Reflections spread like fire, carried by whispers under bunks. Nights in the barracks grew heavier with questions. The women lay on their bunks, staring at the wooden ceilings, whispering in German about the day's gestures, apples, fabric, a smile from across the wire. These were small things, yet they gnawed at the foundations of what they had believed. For years, propaganda reels had hammered a single image. Americans were greedy, corrupt, barbaric. But here, in captivity, they were being fed, clothed, and even offered kindness. The contradiction was impossible to ignore. And interrogation records reveal that 25 to 30% of German POWs showed ideological shifts during captivity. For women, those shifts often came not from pressure, but from daily dissonance. They compared their lives in the Reich, bombed cities, ration cards, harsh officers, to the strange abundance and civility of U.S. camps. Conversations became confessions. If this is our enemy, what have we been fighting for? Others resisted, clinging harder to the party line, but cracks widened all the same. One auxiliary admitted later, "We were fed lies about Americans." It was a stark acknowledgement that echoed across diaries and oral histories. The women debated under their breath. Had Germany lost because of betrayal, or because the enemy was simply stronger? Industrially, materially, even morally. The questions carried danger. To voice them too loudly was to risk accusations of weakness, yet silence only made the contradictions grow louder. NTHE guards noticed the change in atmosphere. Where once the women had been hostile, now they asked tentative questions about towns, farms, or even Hollywood films. Some stared at magazines passed through the wire, comparing the smiling faces of American women with their own reflection in broken mirrors. For a brief moment, they could imagine a different world, one not dictated by uniforms and fear. NNBUT cracks also hurt. With every parcel of food, the guilt of survival deepened. They thought of families starving in Hamburg or Cologne, children shivering in cellars while they received chocolate and dresses in captivity. The realization twisted every bite into both comfort and shame. Captivity offered clarity, but it also magnified the weight of loss. NNTHAT tension, gratitude laced with guilt, marked the beginning of a deeper transformation. Yet the war outside the fences was not finished, and soon orders would come that would force the women to confront a final rupture, leaving the relative safety of American captivity for the ruins of home. By late 1945, orders filtered into the camps. Repatriation. The word stirred both relief and dread. For months, the women had built routines: showers, parcels, sewing circles, Sunday strolls. Now, they were told it was ending. Trucks would come, not to bring them to another American compound, but to carry them eastward, back across the ocean, back to a homeland most barely recognized anymore. Packing began quietly. The dresses were folded carefully, lipstick tubes hidden deep in bags, as though carrying proof that captivity had not erased them. Departure day arrived with the same rattling engines that had once brought them in. The women filed into convoys, this time with straighter posture and heavier silence. Guards, many of them barely older than the prisoners, watched with a mix of relief and regret. Official records note that by 1946, millions of German POWs were shipped back to Europe through ports like New York and Boston, their journeys stretching across months. For these women, the process was slower, often tangled in paperwork and the politics of post-war Europe. North, on the road to embarkation, they glimpsed a world at peace, children running in open fields, shop windows filled with goods, American towns untouched by bombing. The contrast cut deep. They realized that captivity had shown them abundance, but freedom meant return to ruins. Some whispered prayers, others clutched dresses like lifelines. Every mile eastward pulled them further from the strange security of barbed wire and closer to cities flattened by Allied bombs. One woman admitted later, "We dreaded going home." The statement captured the paradox. Captivity had stripped them of freedom, but it had also given them food, safety, and moments of humanity. Home promised freedom, but carried hunger, shame, and suspicion. In Germany, returning POWs were not welcomed as heroes. They were often met with silence, resentment, or pity. For women especially, the stigma of surrender weighed heavily. NNTHE convoys reached ports, and ships loomed like steel giants. As they boarded, the women looked back one last time at the American guards. Some exchanged quick nods, silent farewells acknowledging bonds neither side had expected to form. Then the ropes were pulled, the gangways lifted, and the voyage home began. NNBUT captivity did not end on the ocean. What awaited them in ruined German towns would demand silence. Lipstick and dresses would become memories too fragile, too dangerous, to share openly. When the ships docked and trains carried them into the wreckage of Germany, the women returned not as heroines, but as shadows. Towns were rubble, homes gutted, families scattered. Food was scarce, suspicion abundant. They carried their belongings in small bundles, one or two dresses, a lipstick tube tucked deep inside a pocket. These objects, once symbols of shock and dignity in captivity, now became secrets. To display them openly was to invite questions no one wanted to answer. In the ruins, people asked about bombs, hunger, lost husbands. Few wanted to hear about American parcels or Sunday strolls. Prisoners who spoke of clean barracks or Red Cross gifts were met with silence, sometimes hostility. Many women learned quickly to bury those memories. Diaries from the period fall quiet after 1945. The details of captivity replaced with blank pages or terse notes. The lipstick tubes were hidden in drawers, the dresses repurposed into rags. Evidence of unexpected kindness did not fit the narrative of national suffering, and statistics show that millions of German POWs were processed back into Europe by 1946, yet female voices remain scarce in the records. Those who did write often omitted cosmetics, music, or gestures of comfort. Historians suggest this was deliberate, an unwillingness to complicate a story of victimhood with details that blurred enemy lines. For the women, silence was survival, protecting them from accusations of disloyalty or collaboration. In one auxiliary later confessed in a hushed interview, "No one would believe us." Her words carried the weight of a generation forced to edit its own truth. The memory of American dresses and lipstick clashed too violently with the narrative of collective German suffering. It was easier to forget, or at least to pretend, yet the memories lingered privately, whispered decades later to grandchildren, or scribbled in margins of letters never sent. NNTHE's story of these women reminds us that war is not only measured in battles or treaties. It is also measured in small shocks: lipstick in a parcel, a dress in a crate, a smile through barbed wire. These fragments of humanity did not undo the war's brutality, but they carved fissures in hardened worldviews. In silence they survived. In memory they endured.